Imagine that you were flying your drone over your property and your neighbor accused you of spying on him, trespassing, whatever. And as a result of that, you were arrested. You went to court. You were found guilty of more on that in a second. And then you were ordered to never own a drone again. Now imagine all of that happened and it has implications for everybody in the United States because of the way that this case might set precedent. That's the situation that we're talking about today. This actually happened to somebody. And my guest, Ryan I'm so sorry, Latourette?
Correct. Yes.
Ryan Latourette is going to come and we're going to talk about this situation. And Ryan, this didn't happen to you,
No.
right?
No.
And the reason that the person this happened to is not here talking with me today is because he's in the midst of a legal battle. And when you're in the midst of a legal battle, it's usually not a good idea to go on the internet and talk about what did or didn't happen. So we're going to talk about it, and we can say whatever we want. Ryan,
Great.
thank you for being here. Just so people know I know who you are because I'm on the UAV legal forum on Facebook. Who are you, and why are you qualified to talk to us about this situation?
Well, my name is Ryan Latourette, and I am the Director of Regulatory Affairs for the Great Lakes Drone Company, which is probably the largest drone organization in the Midwest. I've been doing drones for, I want to say, 7 or 8 years now, and I'm invited to a lot of the legal forums around the nation to participate in discussion about drone laws and where we're headed in terms of regulatory practices. In this particular case, I had been alerted to James Benson's downfall, let's put it that way. The plight that was unfolding at the time was that he was charged and being ushered towards court and looking for an expert witness. And so I had volunteered to do that. And I've been involved in a lot of court cases. I get involved in many of these. Probably the one that was most successful as a precedent-setting case right here in Michigan was MCDO versus Genesee County, where a county parks department had decided that you could not fly in the state of Michigan. And despite a state law that said no local subdivisions or local governments could create their own ordinance or enforce their own ordinance. And they actually arrested a drone operator here in Michigan for doing that. And we pushed it through the court and got an injunction on the county. So when I saw James Benson's case, I said, this is another one of those precedent-setting cases that we've got to get involved with. It is essential. And as we go through today, we'll talk those details.
Yeah. So you are both, are you a lawyer?
I am not.
You're not a lawyer. That's okay. I won't hold that against you. You are an expert at drone law, although not a lawyer, and you've been involved with this case from the very beginning. Let's start at the beginning of this case. Who is James Benson, and where does his story start?
Yeah. So, and as you talked about with the case currently pending appeal for the Louisiana State Court, there's some details we won't get into, but I'm going to try to give you as much as we can. But in the case of James Benson, he went out, he bought a brand new drone. He bought an Inspire One. Nothing like getting your very first drone to be an Inspire One. And so what's the first thing that any hobbyist is going to do when they get their first drone? They're going to go up, try it out, and they're going to push it to its limits, of course. So he took his drone, he got it up to about 300, 350 feet, and decided, let's tool it out and see how fast this thing can go and bring it back. So he did. He flew at about 300 to 350 feet, sometimes closer to 400, still remaining under 400 each of the stretches that he flew. And he got the drone flying at about 30 to 40 miles an hour. He took the drone out over his property, went back along a tree line, and came back. And in doing that, he inadvertently crossed over his neighbor's property. We're talking a wooded area.
Yeah, I want to set the stage here a little bit because he lives where does he live? He lives in Louisiana?
Ruston, Louisiana. And we're talking about really, really rural.
Yeah. Like we're not talking about, New York City or any big city. Like, do you know the size of his property?
It's multiple acres. It's quite an expanse. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So he flew along his neighbor's property line, or did he cross into the neighbor's property line?
He had flown along his property line, and at one point he did clip the neighbor's property line. But again, he was over 300 feet when he was doing that. And he was also doing 35, 40 miles an hour at that time. Mm-hmm. So there wasn't this hesitation. There wasn't this, slow down. I'm going to look at things. No, he's moving this thing right along. And so that's where you get the neighbor coming in to say, I don't like you flying over my land.
Right.
And the neighbor comes down and has a little confrontation. And that seemed to be the end of it. And now the trouble is the neighbor in this case happened to be a law enforcement officer, county sheriff with the local parish. So while we think this thing goes away, it really hasn't. It's starting to fester. And the two of them actually don't have a really great relationship. They've had some property disputes before. And so this kind of plays into that as well, where the neighbor's thinking, okay, I'm going to go against this guy in some fashion.
Right.
So we do have a couple other flights that take place. I can tell you one of them actually takes place over the house of the next door neighbor as well. But again, up over 300 feet and moving quite rapidly. So
now I want to pause here because some people are going to hear that and go, "Wait, flew over his house? How dare he?" The way the law is written in the United States, you have the right to fly over other people's property. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yes. And the FAA has sole jurisdiction of airspace, as was granted by the Congress in 1959. So, it's longstanding. As this happens, he's flown these flights. We now have a greater confrontation that takes place. In this situation, we're talking 3 days after the fact. The officer comes back. I should say, a different officer comes back. So we're not even talking the neighbor anymore. A different officer comes back and finds them. It's he and a friend are at this point flying a different drone, and finds them flying and says, "All right, you're under arrest." And so now we have the charges that come into play, where he's detained. One, I don't think he was told that what he was being arrested for, but then the charges come through as criminal trespass.
So he's got a history of confrontation with this neighbor, and he's flying the drone. The neighbor doesn't like that he's flying the drone. So this is why he's not here, because I can just make this stuff up and make these conclusions that maybe a court or a lawyer wouldn't agree with. But the neighbor's mad that he's flying the drone. He comes, he says, "Don't fly over my property." At some point, he flies over his property at an altitude of, was he like buzzing the guy's house? Because the DJI has logs. How high was he when he flew over the guy's house?
We're over 300 feet.
Over 300 feet above the guy's house. Like, how would the guy even know he was up there? The guy basically goes back to one of his buddies at the sheriff's department and says, "Hey, go arrest this guy. He's trespassing." And the sheriff shows up, arrests him. They take him in?
Right. Take him in, they book him, they kept him for a while, and then they released him. Now, here's where it gets kind of interesting. Now we're talking about he's been released, he's out. What's happening with the charges? He's got to go to court, right?
Right.
Well, no. So every single prosecutor that was shown these charges said, "I'm not going to prosecute. I'm not going to do anything with these charges."
This is an important point because prosecutorial discretion is an essential part of the legal process in the United States. A prosecutor has the prerogative to look at a case and go, this case isn't worth proceeding with. I'm not going to push these charges. This is a bunch of BS. And that is a balance to, well, a case where your neighbor who is a police officer decides to maybe abuse his power a little bit to get at you. All the prosecutors, how many, do you have a number? How many prosecutors refused this case?
I don't. I wish I did.
They all said, we're not going to try this guy. Forget it. We're not.
Right.
But they found one, didn't they?
Well, yeah. So what happened is after all these prosecutors, the local prosecutor said, we're not going to do this. The state attorney general himself steps in and says, we as the state attorney general's office are going to prosecute this case. So it's as if they are looking for a particular way to put in place aerial trespass. And This is the case they pick. So now this places James in a real bind. He's going to be charged, or he's already been charged. Now it's actually going to be prosecuted. And the state has 2 years in terms of the length of time before those charges are expunged. So if he's not charged and tried within those 2 years' time, it goes away. Well, they wait until the very last moment, and they do that prosecution. So it happens in February of this year. And as they are doing that, of course, we've got the COVID crisis starting to build up. I was scheduled to be his expert witness to go down there and testify on his behalf. With everything going on, I was not able to get down there. We pleaded to allow the expert witness testimony via Skype or via Zoom or however else, the same way that you would do with a prisoner that you aren't going to bring to court, or the same way that every single court in the nation has done throughout this COVID crisis, with even judges sitting at home asking questions.
Yeah.
Instead, they decided that they would decline the expert testimony over video. And they would decline things like the flight logs, things that were very important.
Back up.
Yeah.
They declined. I mean, that seems like you have the right to present evidence in your defense. It seems like the flight logs that show where and how he flew are a pretty basic piece of evidence. How are they going to deny that he can show his own flight logs in his own case?
That's a good question.
Okay.
That's something. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm certain that's something that will be part of the appeal.
Okay, fine. So the local prosecutors said, we're not touching this. This is a bunch of BS. And if you read between the lines, it seems like what happened is the state attorney decided to use this case to try to make a challenge to the principle that you brought up previously of federal non-preemption. So let's talk about federal non-preemption. The FAA has the sole authority to regulate the national airspace. What is that, and why is that important?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think first and foremost, let's do some history.
Okay.
And that is to go back to 1946 in a case called Cosby versus U.S. So prior to Cosby versus U.S., a property owner was intended to own not just the land that they were standing on, but all the way up till the heavens. So infinity, right? You bought this piece of land, you owned up to the sky. But in 1946, Cosby had this case where he was a chicken farmer. He had purchased a land, had chickens on it, raising the chickens, and the U.S. government came along and bought the adjacent property. On that adjacent property, they built an airport. And throughout their time during, this is, World War II, they were flying the big bomber jet planes, and they were launching these 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So you're talking these huge planes taking off on the property next door, flying over your house as low as 83 feet on a continual basis. Chickens were dying. Wife can't sleep. He can't sleep. This is not a good situation. So he sues, and he sues on the narrow takings clause discussion. And the takings clause of the Constitution basically says, you as the U.S. government cannot come in and take my property without giving me compensation for it. You and I probably know this as eminent domain. If you want to have a trunk from a highway come through your back 40 yard, right?
Right.
then the U.S. government's got to come in with some money and pay you for that.
Right.
Well,
They can take the land, but they
yes,
have to pay you for it.
right.
That's what eminent domain says.
And so in this case, they weren't taking the land, right? Because they weren't building on his land. But the lawyer was very good to say, wait a second, you are really taking that land because we have to own some airspace above that land. The Supreme Court agreed. They set the precedent to say, look, yes, we understand that in today's timeline, it's unreasonable to have a property owner own all the way up to the heavens. We have airplanes, helicopters, hot air balloons. And so they said, we need to cap that. We need to make a portion of the sky public domain. And so that's what they did. They threw out this notion that you own to the heavens. Now, what they didn't do is establish where, at what height you owned up to, but they did say it was up to a usable space, right? So technically, it's going to be your highest element. The tree on your property is 130 feet. Okay, you probably own up to 130 feet. If you're a skyscraper in New York at 1,000 feet, yeah, you probably own 1,000 feet plus a little more.
I see.
But
if you have a 1,000-foot skyscraper and you want to put a radio mast on top, you have the right to that airspace. But if you're a homeowner in rural Louisiana and someone's flying 300 feet above your home, you're not using it. They're not interfering with your use of your property in any way.
Right.
And you don't have the right to say, you're not allowed to fly over my airspace, over my property.
And that's the bingo. So when we go to that precedent setting case, we're saying, look, you as a homeowner, yeah, you've got some right to your land and some airspace above you, but not to the extent that you believe that you've gotten.
Mm-hmm.
And so when he's flying over at 300 feet, well, helicopter can fly over at that and not be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
A Cessna can fly over that doing VFR rules. You could have like the parachute, the paragliders or ultralights, those could fly over. And it's the interesting thing about the rule that the state of Louisiana put in place is that they've said you are trespassing if you are flying an unmanned aircraft.
So
they did not list any other aircraft.
So they're trying to establish that aerial trespass is a thing. And there's a valid question over whether aerial trespass should or should not be a thing. But that's actually not the crux of this issue. The crux of the issue is that states, cities, counties, etc., are legally prohibited from regulating the national airspace in any way. The federal government, by law, exclusively has that right.
Absolutely. And we actually have a court case that proves that. Singer versus Newton City, Massachusetts. Singer was a dentist who was a drone enthusiast. He wanted to fly in his city park. Well, the city park had said, no, you can't fly here. And so he took them to the court and said, look, your ordinance is invalid. And a federal court came through and said, absolutely, this is completely invalid. The field of airspace is entirely occupied by the FAA. And they threw out that Newton City, Massachusetts ordinance.
Now, there are definitely some drone enthusiasts who don't agree with the way that the FAA regulates the airspace. And some people have even argued that federal non-preemption should be gotten rid of, and you should have cities and so forth making their own rules. That's, I think, not an argument that necessarily we need to get into. I think that's a little bit off topic, because what we need to do, the reason I wanted to have you on here in the end is that this guy, sorry, tell me his name again. James
Benson.
James Benson, it needs funds for his appeal so that he got convicted by this judge in some Louisiana parish who's probably, I don't know, is he friends with the sheriff? I don't know what all's going on down there, but I have some experience with small towns, so my mind goes places. He got convicted and he needs to appeal, and he needs to get this thing thrown out. And the only way he can do that is to get out of that parish and get up to, gosh, I mean, if the state attorney's going against him, I don't know, but and so we got a link to a GoFundMe to raise money for his legal defense. And that's actually the reason we're mostly here. And
that is exactly it. He needs those funds To just do the appellate process, it's about $12,000. It is rather expensive. And we know that he's got to do that at the state level because the conviction is at the state level. We still might be able to do something in federal court, but
Right.
we've got to get rid of that conviction first and foremost.
Yeah.
I do think that there's a good opportunity to do that. The decision was poorly made. There's some very big holes in that the lawyer is going to go after, and we should get to that to go through. But the funds have got to be there to make that happen. Well, I'll tell you what my concern is with this case. Okay, we're talking about 300 feet, and that should not be a big concern. Let's get it down to 150 feet, let's say. If 150 feet we're still at aerial trespass, what happens to every Part 107 pilot that goes out and is doing real estate shots? You aren't flying directly over the property of the MLS listing that you're shooting for. You're going to be flying over the neighbor's property.
Right.
And if you're going to be flying over the neighbor's property at 150 feet, your camera is pointing at the listing site, not at the neighbor's property.
Right.
And that's what's happening here, is that they're saying just because you were flying over somebody's property, you're aerial trespass and you are surveilling them. That's not the case at all. Let's look at where that camera is pointing, which wasn't at the property. Let's look at where they are in terms of height, right? They're not sitting on top of the roof of the place. And let's look at, in terms of preemption, you don't have any jurisdiction up there anyway. So what are you really prosecuting?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the big keys here.
Yeah. It seems to me like there's three things going on here. One is that what he's accused of doing shouldn't be illegal. This is an unjust conviction that every single person who flies a drone should be outraged about. And I would hope that alone would be enough to motivate people to come to his defense and donate to his defense. The other is that the thing that he's accused of doing, aerial trespass, when you're at 300 feet flying 30, 40 miles an hour, you are not like staring in anybody's window. All you see, you can't even trespass from that height. The law as written is bogus. And number three, even if those two things didn't apply, they don't have the right to make this law anyway because of federal non-preemption. So, and the real concern is that if this state attorney general is trying to drive a wedge into federal, if this gets appealed to the federal level and doesn't stand, if it doesn't get knocked down rather, then potentially other states will start to try to drive wedges. And this needs to get knocked down, hopefully at the federal level, so we have another confirmation that states don't have the right to do this.
And to really set this in, right, is the idea that even though we haven't gotten this through to a federal level or even to a higher court in the state level, we're already seeing the bleed over into other states. So examples, down in Nashville, during the protests down there, we had Benjamin Dotson go and fly his drone, launches from his property, goes over the top of buildings and takes some pictures, never over people, never near anybody. And he was charged with criminal trespass. Some pretty much the same thing, right? Up in Michigan, we have a new one where an individual was taking some pictures of Part 107, doing construction. Constantly getting the progress pictures,
time lapse.
And so he's out taking these pictures, and as he's pulling away, he sees a laser on his drone. He's like, "Well, wait a minute, you can't laze an aircraft." So he flies the aircraft back to where that laser is coming from and is able to spot the individual that's lasing his aircraft. He calls the police and says, "I need this police report. We need to get this guy over to the FSDO. He needs to be charged with a federal offense for felony of using an aircraft or using a laser to laze an aircraft." Instead, he's arrested. He's thrown into jail, and it's for criminal trespass. So you can already see it's starting to come out in other states. We need to stop it in Louisiana. We have some good lawyers in the other two remaining states. I think we're going to be good there. but Louisiana is our trouble spot right at this point.
Yeah. Okay. And the beauty is that this is, in many ways, an eminently winnable case. The prosecutors refused to even touch it until the state attorney general came in with his own sort of motives, potentially. I speculate. I won't say we. I won't put that on you. I speculate. And the case, there are many ways that an appeal could go, all the way up to, I mean, if it does get to the federal level, it seems like a slam dunk. The feds aren't going to say, oh yeah, go ahead, state of Louisiana, just take over our airspace, you take it, it's all good. It seems like as long as there's money to take it as far as it needs to go, it will be a win. And another way to say, when there are other cases, when this concept of aerial trespass, which needs to just not even exist, we can point to this case and point to other similar cases and say, no, that's not a thing. You can't do that.
Right. And this is kind of the first battle that we all need to get into, because this is going to be another battle down the road for winning the war. There's a real war that's happening in what's called the ULC, the Uniform Law Committee. The Uniform Law Committee has been meeting for several years now, trying to develop an aerial trespass law. And once they get this framework developed, they typically will take this over to Congress and say, here's all the language that you need, just put it in a bill and pass it. Mm-hmm. Typically, when the ULC gets in touch with Congress and has a bill like that, it goes through. So we've been fighting this at the ULC level, and we're starting to see this at the states. If we can fight it at the states, we'll have a better, I'm going to say, like, standing in terms of ULC to make sure that that language meets and fits with our needs as drone operators versus the tinfoil hat types.
Yeah, for sure. I guess the takeaway is, if you're okay with being arrested because you flew 300 feet over your neighbor's property, then don't contribute to this legal defense. But if you think that's a bunch of BS, then this fight needs to happen now. And it's a shame. I go back and forth on this because on some level I'm like, we need to fight this because of the legal implications for all of us. And then I think there's this poor guy who has a conviction against his name. He's currently legally prohibited from owning drones for the rest of his life. I read.
Yeah.
And it's so unfair what happened to him. I'm not sure which I'm more mad about, but I'm going to be making a contribution for sure. And if anybody else out there is watching, there is a link to his GoFundMe in the video description below. And I hope people will contribute.
And Joshua, I'll just chime in to say, when you do contribute, understand even $5, $10, $20 is helpful. I mean, if you can give 50, 100, 250, that's great. But it's a community effort. And that's what we've seen so far in the GoFundMe, is that people are putting in some money as they're able, whether that's $20 to $30, that's great. And it brings up our total such that we can then afford the attorney's fees and the court battle fees.
Well, you said he needs about $12,000 to take the next step. And I'm sure that 5 or 6 or maybe 10 or 12,000 people are going to watch this video. And so we should just basically be there, right?
That's
you go.
The thought.
Okay, I hope so. Cool. Ryan, thank you so much for talking to me.
Josh, thank you for having me. This is so important. I'm glad you were able to reach out and we were able to do this.
I also want to say you are such an asset over on the UAV Legal News and Discussion Facebook group. There's so much bad information on the internet about drone law. And anytime I have a question about drone law, I go to that Facebook. I'll put a link to that Facebook group also down in the video description. If you're in the United States anyway, it's focused on U.S. law, I think. Is that right?
Yes, pretty much, yeah.
So if you're in the U.S. or if you have any questions about U.S. drone law, that is the place to get the right answers. There are people there who are subject matter experts, drone lawyers, ex-FAA inspectors. The people there really know the right answers and can tell you what you need to know. So
absolutely.
It's a really fun group. So cool. All right. Thank you, Ryan. It's going to do
Joshua, thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody. What are you still doing here? The video's over. Do you watch all the videos all the way to the end? Wow. You are a super fan. Thank you. That actually helps the channel a lot when you watch the videos all the way to the end. YouTube loves that. You know what else YouTube loves? When you subscribe. Or when you join my Patreon for as little as $2 a month or more if you feel like I've earned... Actually, YouTube doesn't like you to join my Patreon. They don't get a cut of that.